The 3-year-old child ripped the Luna crown from Kasha's perfectly coiffed head and threw it across the marble floor. The entire pack watched in horror as the golden circlet, blessed by the moon goddess herself, skittered across polished stone and stopped at the feet of a trembling Omega servant girl covered in kitchen grease. Alpha Marcus froze mid-ceremony, his hand still outstretched toward his chosen Luna. The crown had never been rejected. Not in 500 years of pack history. Not once. But his son, little Aurelius, wasn't finished. The toddler climbed down from his father's arms, walked through the stunned silence, picked up the crown with his tiny hands, and placed it directly on the Omega's head. If you're already hooked and want to see where this impossible moment leads, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what happens next will shatter everything you thought you knew about fate, power, and the bonds that truly matter. And tell me the city you're watching from so I can send you a hug. You're going to need it for this emotional journey. Let me take you back 6 months before that moment. Back to when everything seemed perfect. Back to when Alpha Marcus Aurelius Constantine believed he had finally found the Luna his pack deserved. Marcus was not a young alpha. At 34, he had led the Silvercrest pack through war, famine, and political upheaval. His shoulders bore scars from battles that would have killed lesser wolves. His eyes carried the weight of decisions that had saved his pack but cost him pieces of his soul. He was respected, feared, admired, but he was alone. His mate, his true mate, had died in childbirth 3 years ago, taking most of Marcus's heart with her into the darkness. She'd lived just long enough to place their son in his arms, to whisper the name Aurelius, and to make him promise he would love again, that he would give their son a mother, that he would give the pack a Luna. For 3 years, Marcus had honored her first wish. He loved their son with a fierce devotion that sometimes frightened him. But the second wish, that had remained unfulfilled. How could he choose another Luna when every woman he met was measured against a ghost he couldn't stop loving? Then Kasha Valentina entered his life like a summer storm. Beautiful, confident, and utterly certain of her place in the world. She was the daughter of the neighboring Pax Beta, educated in the finest academies, trained in politics and pack management since birth. When she walked, she commanded attention. When she spoke, people listened. She had the kind of beauty that seemed carved by the gods themselves. Sharp cheekbones, cascading auburn hair, eyes like polished emeralds. She looked exactly like what a Luna should be. Marcus's advisors loved her. His beta, Titus Marcellus, practically sang her praises at every council meeting. His warriors respected her tactical mind. Even the pack elders, notoriously difficult to please, nodded their approval when Marcus announced his intention to make Kasha his chosen Luna. "She's perfect," Titus had said, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. "Strong bloodline, intelligent, beautiful. The pack will thrive under her leadership." Marcus had agreed. On paper, Kasha was everything his pack needed. She wasn't his true mate. That gift had been given and taken by the moon goddess already, but she was a logical choice. Good choice. The right choice. So why did something in his chest constrict every time he looked at her? He dismissed it as grief, as the guilt of moving forward when part of him still lived in the past. He'd told himself that what he felt for Kasha wasn't love. Not yet, but it could grow into something substantial, something real. Partnership could be enough. Respect could be enough. He'd been wrong. But he hadn't known that 6 months ago when he'd announced the upcoming Luna ceremony to the pack. He hadn't known it when Kasha had smiled at him with those perfect lips and thanked him for the honor. He hadn't known it when he'd commissioned the crown, the same sacred crown that had adorned every Luna of Silvercrest for generations. 6 months ago, there was only one person who seemed uncertain about the match. One person whose opinion Marcus had dismissed as the instinct of a child who didn't understand adult complications. Aurelius had never liked Kasha. From the first moment she'd entered their home, the boy had hidden behind his father's legs. When she'd tried to embrace him, he'd burst into tears. When she'd attempted to read him bedtime stories, he'd thrown the books across the room. Marcus had apologized profusely, explaining that his son was still adjusting, still grieving in his own way, still too young to understand that Marcus needed to move forward. Kasia had smiled graciously and said she understood, that children were difficult, that Aurelius would come around in time. She'd been patient for about 3 weeks. After that, Marcus began noticing small things. The way Kasia's smile never quite reached her eyes when Aurelius was in the room. The way she'd suggest the boy spend more time with the pack nannies. The way she'd flinch when Aurelius accidentally spilled something or made too much noise during her strategic planning sessions with the council. "He needs structure," she'd said one evening over dinner. Her voice perfectly modulated, perfectly reasonable. "You're too soft with him, Marcus. A future alpha must learn discipline early. My father raised me with clear boundaries, and look how well I turned out." Marcus had felt something cold settle in his stomach at those words, but he'd nodded. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps he was too lenient. Perhaps his grief had made him overcompensate, trying to be both mother and father to a child who needed firm guidance. But when he tried to implement Kasia's suggestions, stricter bedtimes, less playtime, more educational activities for a 3-year-old, Aurelius had become withdrawn. The bright, curious child who'd laughed and played despite losing his mother had started having nightmares. Started wetting the bed again. Started flinching when Marcus raised his voice even slightly. It had taken Marcus exactly 4 days to abandon Kasia's parenting philosophy and return to his instincts. Aurelius was 3 years old. He needed love and security, not the rigid discipline of alpha training. When Marcus had gently told Kasia they'd continue raising Aurelius his way, she'd smiled that perfect smile and acquiesced. But he'd seen something flash in her eyes. Something sharp and cold that was gone before he could examine it properly. He'd dismissed it. She was adjusting too. This was new for everyone. It would get better. Meanwhile, there was someone else in Marcus's territory who was having her own struggles, though Marcus knew nothing about her. Not yet. Lavinia. The name meant nothing to the Alpha. Why would it? She was an Omega, the lowest rank in the pack hierarchy. Omegas didn't attend council meetings or warrior training or strategic planning sessions. They served. They cleaned. They cooked. They remained invisible unless someone needed something. Lavinia had been invisible her entire life. She was 22 years old and had been orphaned at 7 when her parents, both Omegas, had died in the same territorial dispute that had scarred Marcus's back. She'd grown up in the pack's communal housing, raised by a rotation of Omega caretakers who taught her the essential skills of survival. Keep your head down, your voice quiet, and your presence minimal. Don't draw attention. Don't make trouble. Don't expect anything. She'd learned those lessons well. Perhaps too well. Lavinia worked in the pack's central kitchen, starting her shifts before dawn and finishing long after the high-ranking wolves had finished their evening meals. Her hands were perpetually raw from washing dishes in water that was always too hot or too cold. Her back ached from carrying heavy pots. Her feet hurt from standing on stone floors for 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day. But she never complained. Complaining was a luxury Omegas couldn't afford. She had dark hair that she kept tied back in a practical braid, and eyes the color of honey, though almost no one had looked at her long enough to notice. She was short, barely 5'3", with a slight build that made her perfect for squeezing into tight spaces to clean. She had a small scar on her left cheek from a burn she'd gotten at 15 when she'd stumbled carrying a pot of boiling stew. No one had helped her to the healer. She'd wrapped it herself and returned to work the next day. This was Lavinia's life. This was what she expected it would always be. She had no illusions about climbing the pack hierarchy or finding a mate who might elevate her status. She'd seen what happened to Omegas who dreamed too big. They got their hearts broken and their spirits crushed. So Lavinia kept her head down, did her work, and tried to find small joys where she could. The way bread dough felt under her hands when she needed it. The satisfaction of seeing perfectly cleaned dishes stacked and ready for the next meal. The rare moments of kindness from the head cook, an elderly woman named Octavia who sometimes snuck her extra portions when no one was looking. Lavinia's world was small and contained and safe in its predictability. Then Alpha Marcus announced his engagement to Kasia, and Lavinia's predictable world began to crack. It started with the preparations. A Luna ceremony of this magnitude required months of planning. The pack house had to be deep cleaned until it gleamed. Every room, every hallway, every corner had to be perfect for the visiting dignitaries from allied packs. The gardens had to be manicured. The ceremonial grounds had to be prepared. And the feast. Oh, the feast had to be magnificent. A display of Silvercrest's prosperity and power. The workload tripled, then quadrupled. The Omegas worked 20-hour days, snatching sleep in brief intervals, surviving on scraps and sheer determination. Lavinia's hands bled from the harsh soaps and constant work. Her feet developed blisters that burst and bled and developed new blisters on top of them. But worse than the physical exhaustion was the presence of Kasia herself. The future Luna had moved into the pack house 6 weeks before the ceremony to adjust to her new home and learn the pack's operations. In reality, she swept through the halls like a conquering general, finding fault with everything. This floor isn't clean enough. Do it again. These flowers are wilting. Replace them immediately. The silver isn't polished to my standards. I want to see my reflection perfectly. Try again. Lavinia heard these commands secondhand, passed down through the hierarchy of servants. She rarely saw Kasia directly. Omegas were meant to be invisible after all, but she felt the woman's presence like a weight pressing down on the entire staff. The other Omegas whispered about her when they thought no one was listening. About how she'd berated a young servant girl until the girl collapsed in tears. About how she'd demanded the head gardener be fired because a single petal had fallen on her gown. About how she'd suggested to Alpha Marcus that the pack should streamline its Omega population, a polite way of saying some of them should be expelled from pack lands with nowhere to go. Marcus had apparently refused that suggestion, but the fact that Kasia had made it at all sent chills through the Omega quarters. "She's going to make our lives hell," Octavia muttered one night as she and Lavinia prepared bread for the next day's meals. It was past midnight, and they were both swaying with exhaustion. "That woman has no heart, no compassion. She sees us as tools, not people." Lavinia had nodded silently, too tired to speak. But deep in her chest something stirred. Something that felt almost like anger, though she'd been taught her whole life that Omegas didn't get to be angry. They endured. They survived. They accepted. But what if they didn't have to? Lavinia had pushed that treacherous thought away immediately. Of course they had to accept. What choice did they have? She was an Omega. Kasia would be Luna. That was the natural order. That was how the world worked. Except Lavinia had seen Alpha Marcus with his son. It had been an accident, really. She'd been carrying a basket of laundry through one of the hallways when she'd heard laughter. Bright, uninhibited, joyful laughter. She'd frozen, recognizing it as the sound of a child, and her heart had clenched. She'd loved children, had always dreamed of having her own someday, though she knew that was unlikely. Omegas rarely found mates, and children required resources she'd never have. She'd peeked around a corner, unable to help herself, and had seen Alpha Marcus on his hands and knees in one of the gardens while little Aurelius rode on his back like he was a horse. The mighty Alpha, the warrior who'd killed enemy wolves with his bare hands, who commanded one of the strongest packs in the territory, was making neighing sounds and pretending to buck while his son shrieked with delight. Lavinia had stood there, transfixed, watching as Marcus had finally collapsed on the grass in mock exhaustion. Aurelius had climbed off his back and thrown himself at his father's face, planting a kiss on his cheek. Marcus had wrapped his arms around the boy and held him close, and the expression on the Alpha's face had been so tender, so full of pure love, that Lavinia had felt tears prick her eyes. This was who Marcus truly was. Not the stern Alpha in the council chambers. Not the strategic leader planning defensive positions. A father who loved his son with every fiber of his being. And then Kasia's voice had cut through the moment like a blade. "Marcus, really? Rolling in the dirt like a common wolf. What will the servants think?" Lavinia had pressed herself against the wall, making herself as small as possible. She'd watched Marcus's expression shudder, watched him carefully set Aurelius down and stand, brushing grass from his clothes. "Let them think what they will," he'd said quietly. "I'm spending time with my son. Time that would be better spent reviewing the ceremony protocols," Kasha had replied smoothly. "Or did you forget we have the council from the Eastern Territory arriving tomorrow? They'll expect to meet with you, and you can't do that smelling like grass and sweat." Aurelius had hidden behind his father's leg, peeking out at Kasha with obvious fear. The woman hadn't even glanced at him. Marcus had sighed, a sound so heavy with resignation that Lavinia had felt it in her own chest, and nodded. "You're right. Aurelius, let's get you cleaned up for dinner. I've already had the nanny prepare him for his meal in the nursery," Kasha had said. "You and I need to discuss the seating arrangements for the ceremony feast. It's important we present a united front." Lavinia had seen Marcus's jaw tighten, had seen him look down at his son's disappointed face, had seen the moment he'd given in. "Go with Nanny Portia, Aurelius. Papa has work to do." The little boy's face had crumpled, but he'd nodded obediently. As he'd walked past Kasha toward the house, the woman had stepped aside as if avoiding contamination. She hadn't touched him, hadn't offered comfort, hadn't acknowledged him at all beyond moving out of his path. And Lavinia, hiding in the hallway with her basket of laundry, had felt that dangerous something stir in her chest again, that feeling that was too much like anger, too much like injustice. This woman was going to be their Luna. This cold, calculating woman who couldn't see the value in an alpha rolling in the grass with his son, who looked at a grieving 3-year-old with barely concealed disdain. Lavinia had forced herself to move, to continue with her work, to push down those feelings that Omegas weren't allowed to have. But something had shifted in her that day. Some small seed of resistance had been planted. She'd started paying attention. Not deliberately, not with any purpose or plan. But she couldn't seem to help herself. As she moved through the pack house on her endless errands, she found herself noticing things. The way Kasha never smiled when she thought no one was watching. The way she spoke differently to high-ranking wolves than she did to servants, honey and steel, depending on her audience. The way she'd rearrange her features into warmth whenever Marcus appeared, only to let the mask slip the moment he looked away. Lavinia saw because no one saw her. Omegas were furniture, wallpaper, invisible, which meant she was the perfect witness to moments people thought were private. Like the time she'd been cleaning the hallway outside Marcus's office, and had overheard Kasha speaking with her father through the door that had been left slightly ajar. "The ceremony is in 2 weeks, Kasha had said, her voice tight with frustration. "And that child still barely tolerates me." "It doesn't matter," her father had replied. His voice was deeper, rougher. "Once you're Luna, you'll have the authority to send him to boarding school. Train him properly. The boy is too soft anyway. Marcus has ruined him with all that coddling. Marcus won't agree to boarding school. He's obsessed with the boy. Then you'll have to work on that. Slowly, carefully. Make Marcus see that what he thinks is love is actually weakness. Once you have your own pups, heirs with proper breeding and training, he'll see the difference. The boy will fade into irrelevance." Lavinia's hands had frozen on her cleaning cloth. She'd felt sick. They were talking about Aurelius like he was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed. "And the Omega situation?" Kasha had asked. "I still think we should reduce their numbers. They're a drain on resources. One battle at a time, daughter. Secure your position first. Once you're established as Luna, once you have Marcus's trust, you can reshape this pack however you see fit. But rushing will only make him suspicious. He's not as malleable as we'd hoped." Lavinia had fled before she could hear more. Her heart pounding so hard she'd thought it might burst from her chest. She'd hidden in a storage closet and tried to catch her breath, tried to process what she'd just heard. Kasha was planning to send Aurelius away, to have him replaced by her own children, to remake the pack into something harsh and cruel. And there was nothing Lavinia could do about it. She was an Omega. Who would believe her if she tried to tell someone? Who would even listen? She'd be dismissed as a jealous servant spreading rumors. She'd be punished, expelled, maybe worse. So she'd done what Omegas did. She'd kept silent. She'd gone back to work. She'd tried to forget what she'd heard. But she couldn't forget the look on little Aurelius's face when Kasia had stepped aside to avoid him. Couldn't forget the sound of his laughter when his father had played with him. Couldn't forget that a child was in danger, and everyone was too blind to see it. The weeks had crawled by. The preparations had intensified to a fever pitch. Lavinia had worked until her body moved on autopilot, until she couldn't remember what it felt like not to be exhausted. And then, 3 days before the ceremony, something happened that changed everything. Lavinia had been carrying a tray of fresh pastries to the Alpha's private dining room, a rare assignment, as Omegas usually weren't allowed in the family quarters. But the regular server had fallen ill, and Octavia had sent Lavinia in her place with strict instructions to be invisible and silent. She'd been walking down the hallway when she'd heard crying. Soft, muffled sobs coming from behind a partially closed door. She should have kept walking. It wasn't her business. She was already terrified of being in this part of the house. But the crying sounded so heartbroken, so utterly devastated, that her feet had carried her to the door before she'd consciously decided to move. Through the crack, she'd seen Aurelius sitting on the floor of what must have been his bedroom, surrounded by toys he wasn't playing with. Tears streamed down his chubby cheeks, and he was clutching a stuffed wolf that looked well-loved and worn. "Want Mama," he'd sobbed to the toy. "Want Mama back. Don't want new Mama. Just mean. She doesn't love Ori. Want real Mama." Lavinia's heart had shattered. She'd set down the tray, carefully, quietly, and had knelt by the door. "Hello," she'd said softly. Aurelius had jerked his head up, his golden eyes, so like his father's, wide with surprise and fear. "I'm not supposed to talk to servants," new Mama said. That's a good rule," Lavinia had replied, though the words had tasted like ash. "But I heard you crying and I couldn't just walk away. Are you okay?" "No," he'd said with the brutal honesty of a toddler. "I'm sad. Papa is going to have a new Mama, and she doesn't like me. She wants me to go away." "I'm sure that's not true," Lavinia had lied, even as she'd remembered the conversation she'd overheard. "It is true," Aurelius had insisted. "She looks at me like I'm yucky, like I'm bad. Papa doesn't see it, but I see it. And after the ceremony, Papa will love her more than me because she's going to be Luna and I'm just Ori." The matter-of-fact way he'd said it, like he'd already accepted his own irrelevance, had made Lavinia's eyes burn with tears she couldn't shed. She'd done something incredibly stupid then. Something that could have gotten her expelled from the pack or worse. She'd pushed the door open fully and had walked into the room. She'd knelt down in front of Aurelius and had looked him straight in the eyes. "Your papa loves you more than anything in the whole world," she'd said fiercely. "More than being Alpha. More than this pack. More than anything. And anyone who can't see how special you are is the one who's wrong. Not you. Never you." Aurelius had stared at her with those big golden eyes, and something in his expression had shifted. "You're nice. What's your name?" "Lavinia." "That's pretty." He'd smiled then, a small, watery smile. "Do you work here?" "I do." "In the kitchens? Do you make the cookies? The ones with jam?" "Sometimes. Those are my favorite." He'd paused, then held out his stuffed wolf. "This is Lupus. He was Mama's. Papa gave him to me after Mama went to the moon goddess. Lupus is sad too." Lavinia had gently touched the worn toy. "Then maybe Lupus and you can be sad together. And maybe when you're very sad, you can remember that someone in the kitchens thinks you're the most important person in this whole pack. More important than Papa. Different important. Your Papa keeps everyone safe. But you're going to grow up to be an Alpha who keeps everyone safe and makes them happy. I can tell." She had no idea where these words were coming from. She should have left. Should have run. But sitting with this grieving child, She'd felt more purposeful than she'd felt in years. Lavinia. Aurelius had said her name carefully, like he was testing how it sounded. Will you be my friend? It was such a simple request. So innocent. And so impossible. Lavinia had started, then had stopped. How could she explain to a 3-year-old about pack hierarchy and social rules and all the reasons why an Omega and a future Alpha couldn't be friends? But looking at his hopeful face, she hadn't been able to say no. Yes, she'd whispered. I'll be your friend. Secret friends, Aurelius had said solemnly. Because new mama doesn't like me to have friends. She says friends make you weak. Lavinia had felt that dangerous anger flare again. What kind of person told a child that friends made them weak? Secret friends, she'd agreed. She'd stayed with him for 10 more minutes, helping him build a tower out of blocks, listening to him chatter about his toys and his papa and his dreams of being a strong alpha someday. And for those 10 minutes, Lavinia had felt like she mattered, like she was doing something important. Then reality had crashed back in. She'd heard footsteps in the hallway, adult footsteps, and had panicked. She'd fled from the room, grabbing her tray and practically running down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. She'd thought that would be the end of it. One moment of connection, one small rebellion, then back to her normal invisible existence. But Aurelius, it turned out, didn't forget. Over the next 3 days he sought her out. When she was crossing through the gardens with laundry, he'd appear and walk beside her, chattering about his day. When she was in the hallways, he'd peek around corners and wave at her like they shared a marvelous secret. When she was serving in the dining hall, he'd smile at her, just at her, like she was the only person in the room. Lavinia had tried to discourage him, had tried to maintain proper distance. But how could she turn away from a child who just wanted someone to see him, someone to care? And Marcus had noticed. On the day before the ceremony, Lavinia had been in one of the side gardens, hanging laundry to dry in the sun. She'd been alone, grateful for the rare moment of peace, when she'd heard Aurelius's voice. Lavinia! Lavinia, look what I found. She'd turned to see him running toward her, his little legs pumping as fast as they could carry him. In his hands he'd clutched a dandelion, not even a flower really, just a weed that had been missed by the gardeners. For you, he'd said proudly, thrusting it toward her. Because you're my friend. Lavinia had been about to respond when she'd noticed the figure standing at the edge of the garden. Alpha Marcus, watching them with an expression she couldn't read. She'd dropped into a bow immediately, her heart in her throat. Alpha, forgive me. I wasn't encouraging. You're the Omega from the kitchen, Marcus had interrupted. His voice hadn't been angry, just curious. Lavinia, is it? Yes, Alpha. She'd kept her eyes down, every instinct screaming at her to make herself small and invisible. Aurelius speaks of you. Marcus had walked closer, and Lavinia had felt the power rolling off him in waves. This was an Alpha in his prime, a warrior, a leader. And she was nothing. He says you're his secret friend. I apologize, Alpha. I didn't mean to overstep. I know my place. It won't happen again. There had been a long pause. Then, look at me. It wasn't a request. Lavinia had raised her eyes, expecting to see anger or disgust. Instead, she'd seen something that looked almost like sadness. My son has been struggling, Marcus had said quietly. Ever since I announced my engagement to Kasia. He has nightmares, refuses to eat, cries when he thinks I can't hear him. I've been so focused on pack business, on preparing for the ceremony, that I failed to see how much he needs support. He misses his mother, Lavinia had said before she could stop herself. Then, horrified at her own boldness. Forgive me. I shouldn't have. No, you're right. He does. Marcus had looked at his son, who was now trying to add the dandelion to Lavinia's laundry basket. But he also needs to know he's not being replaced, that he matters. And somehow, you've shown him that in a way I haven't been able to. Lavinia hadn't known what to say to that. Marcus had crouched down to Aurelius's level. "Son, Lavinia has work to do. We can't interrupt her." "But she's my friend, Papa. And friends spend time together." "Yes, but friends also respect each other's responsibilities. Lavinia has important work in the kitchen. The whole pack needs her to do that work well. Do you understand?" Aurelius had nodded reluctantly. Then he'd turned to Lavinia. "Will I see you at the ceremony tomorrow?" "I'll be working in the kitchen, young master. I won't be at the ceremony itself." His face had fallen so dramatically that Lavinia had felt physically ill. Marcus had studied her for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he'd smiled. It had been a small smile, tired and tinged with something melancholy, but real. "Perhaps we can arrange for you to have a break from your duties during the ceremony," he'd said. "Just for a few minutes. So Aurelius can see a friendly face in the crowd." Lavinia had been stunned. "Alpha, that's not necessary. I'm sure the head cook needs. I'll speak to Octavia. She'll understand." Marcus had stood, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "Everyone deserves to witness history, don't they? Even those who work in the shadows to make that history possible." It had been the kindest thing anyone of rank had ever said to Lavinia. She'd felt tears prick her eyes and had blinked them away quickly. "Thank you, Alpha." Marcus had nodded, then led Aurelius away. But the boy had looked back over his shoulder and waved at her, his smile bright enough to rival the sun. Lavinia had stood there in the garden, holding a dandelion weed like it was made of gold, and had felt something shift in her chest. Something huge and terrifying and wonderful. Oh, for what she didn't know. But for the first time in her life, Lavinia had dared to feel like maybe she was more than just a servant. Maybe she was a person who mattered to someone. Even if that someone was just a lonely 3-year-old child. The next day had dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for a Luna ceremony. The pack had been buzzing with excitement since before sunrise. Visiting dignitaries had arrived from allied packs. The ceremonial grounds had been decorated with thousands of flowers. The feast had been prepared, tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, fresh breads, pastries, and delicacies that had taken weeks to prepare. Lavinia had worked through the night with the other kitchen staff, catching maybe 2 hours of sleep before dawn. Her hands had been shaking with exhaustion as she'd helped arrange platters, but she'd pushed through. This was the biggest event Silvercrest had hosted in years. Everything had to be perfect. At noon, Octavia had found her elbow deep in dishwater and had pulled her aside. "The Alpha requested you be allowed to watch the ceremony," the old woman had said, her expression somewhere between amused and bewildered. "I don't know what you did to earn that privilege, girl, but don't waste it. Go change into something clean and get yourself to the ceremonial grounds. You have 1 hour." Lavinia had stared at her. "But the dishes will still be here when you get back." "Oh." The Alpha doesn't make requests lightly. So Lavinia had washed her face and hands, had changed into the only decent dress she owned, a simple gray thing that had seen better days, and had made her way to the ceremonial grounds. The circle had been set up in the center of the pack's main courtyard, a raised platform surrounded by hundreds of pack members and guests. Lavinia had slipped into the very back of the crowd, making herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. She'd been surrounded by high-ranking wolves in their finest clothes, their jewelry glittering in the sunlight, and had felt painfully out of place. But she'd promised Aurelius she'd be there. And somehow, that had mattered more than her discomfort. The ceremony had begun with traditional pack blessings. Elders had spoken about the sacred bond between Alpha and Luna, about the prosperity and protection a strong Luna brought to the pack. Musicians had played ancient songs while dancers had performed rituals that dated back centuries. Then Marcus had appeared, and the crowd had fallen silent. He'd looked magnificent and utterly miserable. He'd worn traditional ceremonial robes in deep black and silver, the colors of Silvercrest. His dark hair had been pulled back, revealing the strong lines of his face. But his eyes had looked haunted. Kasia had appeared next, and Lavinia had heard the crowd's collective intake of breath. She'd been stunning. Her ceremonial gown had been pure white, embroidered with gold thread that caught the light with her every movement. Her auburn hair had been arranged in an elaborate style, woven with flowers and jewels. She'd looked like a goddess descending to earth. But Lavinia, standing in the back, had seen what others might have missed. The calculating gleam in Kasha's eyes as she'd surveyed the crowd. The way her smile had been a fraction too wide, too perfect, like something rehearsed. The way she'd looked at Marcus not with love or even affection, but with triumph. This was a coronation, not a commitment. Kasha was here to claim power, not partnership. The high priestess had led them through the ancient vows. Kasha had spoken her promises with a voice like honey, sweet and flowing and utterly convincing. Marcus had responded with the required words, but his voice had been flat, mechanical. The voice of someone fulfilling a duty, not embracing a destiny. Then had come the moment everyone had been waiting for. The crowning. The Luna crown of Silvercrest was legendary. Forged 500 years ago by the pack's greatest craftsman, blessed by the moon goddess herself, it was said to recognize the true Luna of the pack. It was said that the crown would only rest properly on the head of a Luna chosen by fate, not just by an alpha's will. Marcus had dismissed that as superstition. The crown was a symbol, nothing more. Beautiful and meaningful, yes, but not magical. He'd been holding Aurelius during this part of the ceremony. The boy's nursemaid had brought him forward as tradition dictated. The future alpha's presence was required during the crowning, a symbol of continuity and blessing from one generation to the next. Marcus had felt Aurelius tense in his arms as the high priestess had lifted the crown from its velvet cushion. The gold had gleamed in the sunlight, ancient and powerful and heavy with history. "With this crown I name you Luna of Silvercrest," the priestess had intoned. "May you lead with wisdom, protect with strength, and love with your whole heart." Marcus had begun to reach for the crown, ready to place it on Kasha's head himself as tradition required. But Aurelius had suddenly twisted in his arms with surprising strength. "No!" the child had cried. "No, Papa. Not her. Not her." The crowd had gasped. Marcus had tried to soothe his son, embarrassment flooding his cheeks. "Aurelius, son, we talked about this." But Aurelius hadn't been listening. With the singular determination of a toddler on a mission, he'd lunged for the crown. His small hands had grabbed it before anyone could react, and he'd ripped it from the high priestess's grasp. "Aurelius!" Kasha's voice had been sharp, all pretense of gentleness gone. "You little brat, give that back." The crowd had watched in stunned horror as the 3-year-old had thrown himself out of his father's arms. Marcus had caught him, setting him down to avoid injury, and had hurled the crown away from Kasha like it burned his hands. The golden circlet had sailed through the air, tumbling end over end, and had skittered across the marble platform. It had rolled down the steps, 1, 2, 3, and had come to rest at the feet of someone standing at the very edge of the crowd. At Lavinia's feet. Time had seemed to stop. Every eye in the courtyard had turned to look at the Omega girl in the shabby grey dress, standing frozen in horror with the Luna crown at her feet. Lavinia's mind had gone blank with terror. This couldn't be happening. This was a nightmare. She'd be punished for this somehow, blamed for being in the wrong place, for existing at all. She'd started to bend down to pick up the crown, to return it, to apologize, to somehow fix this disaster, when Aurelius had appeared in front of her. The little boy had moved faster than anyone would have thought possible. He'd darted through the crowd, had dodged grasping hands, and had reached Lavinia before his father or anyone else could stop him. He'd picked up the crown with his small hands, had looked up at Lavinia with absolute certainty in his golden eyes, and had spoken in a clear voice that carried across the suddenly silent courtyard. "This is the real Luna. The moon goddess told me. This one loves me. This one loves Papa. This one loves everybody." And then, while hundreds of high-ranking wolves watched in disbelief, Aurelius had lifted the crown above his head and had placed it on Lavinia's dark hair. The crown had settled on her head like it had been made for her. Like it had been waiting for her all along. And then something impossible had happened. The crown had begun to glow. Not brightly, not dramatically, just a soft golden light that seemed to pulse in time with Lavinia's heartbeat. The ancient metal had warmed against her skin, and for a moment, just one crystalline moment, Lavinia had felt the presence of something vast and ancient and filled with love. The moon goddess. "No," Kasha had breathed, her face going white. "No, that's impossible. She's an omega. An omega. She can't be." But the words had died in her throat as the light had grown stronger. As every wolf in the courtyard had felt it. A pull, a recognition, a rightness that couldn't be denied. This was their Luna. This had always been their Luna. Marcus had stood frozen on the platform, staring at Lavinia with an expression of complete shock. But Lavinia had seen something else dawn in his eyes too. Recognition. Not of her specifically, but of the truth his son had seen all along. Kasha had never been right. The political match, the logical choice, the perfect candidate on paper. None of it had mattered because the moon goddess had already chosen. "Remove that crown immediately," Kasha had hissed, finding her voice again. "This is a farce. A disgusting display of. The crown has chosen." The high priestess's voice had rung out, ancient and powerful. She'd moved to stand beside Lavinia, her eyes wide with wonder. In 500 years, the crown has never glowed for anyone. Not once. The old legends speak of this, that when the true Luna stands before her pack, the crown will shine with the moon goddess's blessing. "Legends are just stories," Kasha had snapped. She'd turned to Marcus, her control slipping. "Marcus, tell them. Tell them this is ridiculous. That girl is nothing. She's nobody. You can't seriously be considering." "She's my friend," Aurelius had said, moving to stand in front of Lavinia protectively. His small body had been trembling, but his voice had been fierce. "And she's nice. And she makes Papa smile when she doesn't even know he's watching. And she gives me cookies when I'm sad. And the crown picked her. So there." The crowd had erupted in murmurs. Lavinia had stood there, wanting to sink into the earth and disappear, but unable to move because Aurelius was holding her hand and the crown on her head felt like an anchor keeping her rooted in place. Marcus had slowly descended from the platform. Each step had seemed to cost him, but he'd kept moving until he stood directly in front of Lavinia. Up close, she'd been able to see every detail of his face. The lines around his eyes, the gray threading through his dark hair, the old scars and new worries. "What's your full name?" he'd asked quietly. "Lavinia Aurelia, Alpha." Her voice had been barely a whisper. "How long have you been part of this pack?" 15 years, Alpha. Since my parents died in the western border skirmish." Something had flickered across Marcus's face at that. Pain perhaps. Or recognition. "I remember that battle. I lost good people that day. I'm sorry for your loss." Lavinia hadn't known what to say to that. No one had ever apologized to her for her parents' deaths. They'd just been omegas. Casualties. Acceptable losses. Marcus had looked at his son, still standing protectively in front of Lavinia. "Aurelius, do you understand what you've done?" "I picked the right Luna," Aurelius had said with absolute confidence. "The one the moon goddess wanted. The one who will love us right." "And how do you know that?" "Because I asked the moon goddess every night. I asked her to help Papa find someone who would love him and love me and love our pack. And then I met Lavinia and I knew. I just knew, Papa." Marcus had closed his eyes for a long moment. When he'd opened them again, they'd been glassy with unshed tears. "You asked the moon goddess for a Luna who would love us." "Yes, Papa. And you think Lavinia is that Luna?" "I know she is. Don't you feel it? Don't you feel how right it is?" And Marcus, surrounded by his pack and his council and his would-be Luna and hundreds of witnesses, had looked at Lavinia, really looked at her for the first time. Had seen past the shabby dress and the omega status and the social impossibility of what his son was suggesting. He'd seen her. The woman who'd comforted his crying son when she'd had no obligation to do so. The woman who'd spoken of Aurelius as the most important person in the pack. The woman who'd accepted a dandelion weed like it was a precious gift. The woman who stood before him now with terror and confusion and something that looked achingly like hope in her honey-colored eyes. And he'd felt it. Pull. The recognition. The bone-deep certainty that his son was right. "This is insane," Kasia had said, her voice rising. "You can't possibly be considering this. She's an Omega, Marcus. She has no education, no training, no bloodline. She can't even read pack law. How could she possibly be Luna? The crown chose her. The High Priestess's voice had been firm. The Moon Goddess chose her. Who are we to question divine will? Divine will." Kasia had laughed, but it had been an ugly sound. "This is manipulation. That child has been manipulated by a servant girl looking to climb above her station. Can't you see that?" "Watch your tone," Marcus had said quietly, but there had been steel in his voice. "You're speaking about a member of my pack. And about my son. I'm speaking truth. That Omega has been seducing your child to get to you. It's obvious. She's been using him." "Enough." The single word had cracked like a whip. Marcus had straightened to his full height, and suddenly he'd been every inch the alpha. Powerful, commanding, unmistakable in his authority. "You will not speak of Lavinia that way. You will not accuse her of manipulation without proof. And you will not call my son a fool for seeing what apparently none of us were wise enough to see." Kasia had gone very still. "You're choosing her. Over me. Over our agreement. Over the alliance our union would create. I'm choosing to honor my son's wisdom and the Moon Goddess's will." "Yes. You'll regret this," Kasia had hissed. "When your pack is led by an Omega who can't even hold a political conversation. When your allies abandon you for making a mockery of the Luna tradition. When my son is happy," Marcus had interrupted. "When my pack is led by someone who actually cares about them instead of seeing them as tools for power. When I finally fulfill the promise I made to my mate, that I would find someone who could love us. Yes, I think I can live with those consequences." Kasia's mask had finally shattered completely. Rage and humiliation had twisted her beautiful features into something ugly. "You fool. You absolute fool. This Omega will destroy everything you've built. And when she does, when your pack falls apart because you chose sentiment over sense, remember that I offered you strength and you chose weakness." She'd ripped off her ceremonial gown's outer layer and had thrown it at Marcus's feet. Then, with whatever dignity she'd had left, she'd stalked through the crowd toward the pack house, presumably to collect her things and leave. Her father had followed, shooting Marcus a look of pure venom. The alliance between their packs was over. Finished. But Marcus hadn't seemed to care. He'd turned back to Lavinia, who stood trembling with the crown still glowing softly on her head. "Lavinia Aurelia," he'd said formally. "The crown has chosen you. My son has chosen you. And if you're willing, I would choose you too. Alpha, I can't. I'm not qualified to. None of us are qualified for the roles the Moon Goddess gives us," Marcus had said gently. "But we try anyway. We learn. We grow. And we trust that there's a reason we've been called to this path. But I'm an Omega. I don't know how to be Luna. I don't know politics or strategy or, how to see people, to care about them, to love a lonely child who needed someone to care." Marcus had reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and had taken her hand. His hand had been warm and calloused, the hand of a warrior and worker. That's what a Luna is supposed to be. Not a political strategist or a master manipulator. A Luna is the heart of the pack. And I think you might be exactly the heart we've needed all along." Lavinia had looked down at their joined hands, then up at Marcus's face, then at Aurelius, who was grinning so wide his face looked like it might split in half. "I'm scared," she'd whispered. "So am I," Marcus had admitted. "I've been scared for 3 years. Scared of choosing wrong. Scared of hurting my son. Scared of dishonoring my mate's memory. But for the first time since she died, I feel like maybe I'm being guided toward something right instead of just trying to avoid something wrong. What if I fail? Then we'll fail together. And we'll get back up and try again. That's what family does. Family. The word had hit Lavinia like a physical force. She'd never had family, not really. Her parents had died when she was so young. She'd been raised by a rotating door of caretakers who saw her as an obligation, not a daughter. She'd been alone for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to belong to someone. To matter to someone. Papa. Aurelius had tugged on Marcus's robe. Is Lavinia going to be my new mama now? Marcus had looked at Lavinia, and she'd seen the question in his eyes. A hope. The possibility of something neither of them had expected but both of them desperately needed. That depends, Marcus had said to his son. Lavinia has to choose too. Being Luna isn't just about ceremonies and crowns. It's about commitment. To the pack. Me. To you. And it's her choice whether she wants that. Lavinia had felt tears sliding down her cheeks. A few hours ago, she'd been washing dishes in the kitchen, invisible and insignificant. Now she stood in the center of everything, wearing a glowing crown and being asked to make a decision that would change the course of hundreds of lives. It should have been terrifying. It was terrifying. But underneath the terror was something else. Something that felt like coming home after being lost for years. She'd looked at Aurelius, who was watching her with those hopeful golden eyes. She'd thought about all their secret conversations, all the time she'd comforted him, all the joy she'd felt at making him smile. She'd looked at Marcus, at the vulnerability and hope in his expression, at the way he held his son like he was the most precious thing in the world. And she'd made her choice. Yes, she'd said. If you'll have me, yes, we'll try. I'll probably make mistakes and I definitely don't know what I'm doing, but... Yes. Aurelius had launched himself at her, wrapping his small arms around her legs and laughing. Marcus had smiled, really smiled, for the first time since the ceremony had begun. And the crown on Lavinia's head had pulsed with warm golden light, as if the moon goddess herself was pleased. The high priestess had raised her hands for silence. Let it be known throughout all territories. Silvercrest has found its Luna. Lavinia Aurelia, chosen by the crown, blessed by the moon goddess, accepted by the Alpha and his heir. From this day forward, she is our Luna, and any who challenge her challenge the divine will itself. The crowd had erupted, some in cheers, some in shocked murmurs, some in obvious disapproval. But Marcus had taken Lavinia's hand and Aurelius's hand, and had led them both up onto the platform. This is my Luna, he'd said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. This is our Luna. And anyone who has a problem with the moon goddess's choice is welcome to take it up with her directly. There had been nervous laughter at that. But slowly, tentatively, pack members had begun to bow, to accept, to acknowledge that something unprecedented and impossible had just happened, and that fighting it was useless. The ceremony had continued, but completely differently than planned. Lavinia had spoken vows she barely remembered, her voice shaking but sincere. Marcus had held her hand through the entire thing, his grip steady and sure. And when it was time for the kiss to seal the bond, a formality really since they weren't true mates, Marcus had leaned in and whispered, "We'll take this as slowly as you need. I'm not expecting love, just partnership, and hope that maybe someday it could be more." He'd kissed her forehead instead of her lips. Gentle, respectful, kind. And Lavinia, for the first time in her 22 years, had felt like she might actually deserve kindness. The feast that followed was surreal. Lavinia sat at the head table, with Marcus on one side and Aurelius on the other. High-ranking wolves who had never deigned to notice her existence were now trying to make conversation. She'd been terrified she'd use the wrong fork or say something inappropriate, but Marcus had quietly guided her through it, his hand occasionally touching her elbow or back in reassurance. "You're doing fine," he'd murmured during a lull in conversation. "Better than fine. You're being yourself, and that's exactly what they need to see." "I don't know how to be Luna," she'd admitted. "Neither did my mate when she first took the role. Neither did her mother before her. It's not about knowing everything from the start. It's about caring enough to learn. Octavia had appeared at one point. Her weathered face split in a grin. Well, girl. You certainly found a way to get out of dish duty. Lavinia had burst into startled laughter, and somehow that had broken the tension. She'd relaxed marginally, had actually managed to eat something, and had even responded to a few questions about her background with something approaching confidence. But the real test had come 3 days later, when reality had set in. Lavinia had moved into the Luna's quarters, a suite of rooms that was bigger than any space she'd ever occupied in her life. She had servants now. Servants. People who bowed to her and called her Luna and waited for her instructions. It was simultaneously overwhelming and absurd. Marcus had given her time to adjust, staying in his own quarters and only joining her for meals and pack business. They were functionally strangers trying to build a partnership from nothing, and they both seemed to sense that rushing would doom them both. But Aurelius had no such reservations. The boy had attached himself to Lavinia like a barnacle, following her everywhere, chattering constantly, demanding her attention and affection with the shameless entitlement of a child who'd finally found what he'd been searching for. Read me a story, Mama Lavinia. Play blocks with me, Mama Lavinia. Can we have cookies, Mama Lavinia? Mama Lavinia. He'd started calling her that the day after the ceremony, and it had made her cry the first 7 times. Now she just smiled and corrected him gently that she wasn't quite Mama yet, that she and Papa were still getting to know each other. But Aurelius had been undeterred. You're my Mama in my heart, he'd said with toddler logic. That's what matters. And how could she argue with that? The pack's reaction had been mixed. The Omegas had been stunned into cautious hope. If one of their own could become Luna, what did that mean for the rest of them? The warriors had been skeptical but willing to watch and wait. The council had been divided, with some seeing Lavinia's elevation as a dangerous precedent, and others seeing it as the moon goddesses will made manifest. And then there were the challenges. The first had come from a beta named Quintus who'd been a strong supporter of Cassia. He'd challenged Marcus's decision in council, arguing that an Omega Luna made the pack look weak to their enemies. She has no training, Quintus had said, his voice dripping with disdain. No education. No political connections. How can she possibly represent us in negotiations with other packs? Lavinia had been present for that council meeting, sitting beside Marcus in the Luna's chair that felt too big and too important. She'd felt every eye in the room on her, judging her, finding her lacking. But before Marcus could respond, someone unexpected had spoken up. Titus Marcellus, the beta who'd so strongly supported Cassia's candidacy, had cleared his throat. May I speak, Alpha? Marcus had nodded, curiosity in his expression. I was wrong, Titus had said simply. About Cassia. About what we needed in a Luna. I was so focused on political advantage and strategic alliances that I forgot what a Luna's true role is. I forgot that my own mate, rest her soul, had been a simple pack teacher before she became my partner. She had no political connections, no powerful family. But she had heart. She cared about our people. She saw them. And she made me a better leader because of it. He'd looked directly at Lavinia. I've watched our new Luna this past week. I've seen how the Omegas look at her with hope instead of resignation. I've seen how she spends her mornings in the pack nursery, learning the names of every pup. I've seen how she asks questions in these meetings instead of pretending she knows everything. And I think the moon goddess knew what she was doing. The room had been silent. Lavinia had stared at Titus in shock. This was the man who'd championed Cassia, who'd seemed so certain that Lavinia would be a disaster. The crown chose her, Titus had continued. Our future Alpha chose her. The moon goddess chose her. Who are we to say they're all wrong? Perhaps it's time we trusted in divine wisdom over our own limited understanding. Quintus had sputtered trying to argue, but other voices had joined Titus. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to show that Lavinia had supporters beyond just Marcus and Aurelius. That night, after Aurelius had finally fallen asleep, Marcus had found Lavinia on the balcony of her quarters, staring up at the moon. "You handled that well," he'd said, coming to stand beside her. "I didn't do anything. Titus defended me." "You earned that defense. By being genuine. By admitting what you don't know instead of pretending. By caring about people instead of power." He'd paused. "That's what a Luna does." Lavinia had looked at him. Really looked at him. In the moonlight, he'd looked younger somehow. Less burdened. "Do you regret it? Choosing me over Kasia? Over political advantage?" Marcus had been quiet for a long moment. "Ask me that a year from now. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I can give right now. I don't know if this was a brilliant decision or a massive mistake. I don't know if you'll thrive in this role or struggle with it. I don't know if we'll ever be more than two people bound by circumstance and a child's intuition." He'd turned to face her fully. "But I know that for the first time in 3 years my son is happy. I know that I sleep better at night because I'm not trying to force something that never felt right. And I know that when I look at you, I don't feel the crushing weight of duty. I feel possibility." Possibility of what? I don't know yet. And that's terrifying. But maybe it's also exciting. They'd stood there in comfortable silence, and Lavinia had felt something shift between them. Not love, not yet, maybe not ever, but something that could become friendship, partnership, trust. It was enough. For now it was enough. 6 months have passed since that impossible day when a 3-year-old child changed the course of a pack's destiny. 6 months of Lavinia learning how to be Luna, of making mistakes and learning from them, of slowly earning the respect of a pack that had initially seen her as a joke. She's not perfect. She still stumbles over protocol sometimes. She still second-guesses herself in council meetings. She still feels like an imposter wearing clothes too fine and sitting in chairs too important. But she's learning. And more importantly, she's leading with her heart instead of her head. She's reformed the Omega treatment programs, giving them better housing and fair wages. She's established a pack school where all children, regardless of rank, learn together. She's created support systems for grieving wolves and new mothers and anyone who falls through the cracks of pack society. The other packs watch with a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Some still whisper that Silvercrest is weak for having an Omega Luna. But others see the changes, the increased loyalty, the decreased unrest, the pups growing up believing they can be anything instead of just what their birth rank dictates. And they wonder if maybe the moon goddess knew what she was doing after all. Marcus and Lavinia still sleep in separate rooms, but they share breakfast every morning with Aurelius. They walk the pack lands together in the evenings. They laugh at Aurelius's antics and debate pack policy and slowly, carefully, build something that looks like a family. There's no grand romance. No passionate declarations. Just two broken people trying to honor the roles they've been given and a child who brought them together because he believed in love when everyone else believed in logic. "Do you think we'll ever be true mates?" Lavinia asks Marcus one night, 6 months and 3 days after she became Luna. They're in his study, reviewing requests from pack members, and the question slips out before she can stop it. Marcus looks up from his papers, surprise flickering across his face. Then he smiles, that soft smile that he seems to reserve just for her and Aurelius. "I don't know," he admits. "The moon goddess gives the mate bond to who she chooses, when she chooses. I had a true mate once, and I loved her with everything I had. I don't know if I'm capable of that again." "That's not what I asked." "No. I asked if you think we ever will be. Not if you're capable of it." Marcus sets down his papers and gives her his full attention. "Do you want us to be?" Lavinia considers the question carefully. 6 months ago, she would have said yes immediately. Of course she wanted to be true mates with her alpha, with a man who'd given her a life she'd never dreamed possible. But now, after living with him, learning him, building a partnership with him, now her answer is more complicated. "I want us to be happy," she finally says. "Whatever that looks like. If the moon goddess grants us a mate bond, wonderful. If she doesn't, and we build something real anyway, that's wonderful too. I don't want to spend my life waiting for something that might never come and missing what we already have." Marcus's expression softens into something achingly tender. When did you become so wise? I learned from my son. Our son, Marcus corrects gently. He's ours now, whether biology agrees or not. And it's true. Aurelius calls her mama without hesitation now. He comes to her with his nightmares and his triumphs, his questions and his secrets. She's the one who tends his scraped knees and reads his bedtime stories and holds him when he cries for the mother he barely remembers. Our son, Lavinia agrees, and the words feel like a vow. Marcus stands and crosses to her, offering his hand. Dance with me. There's no music. Then we'll make our own. It's ridiculous. It's impractical. They have work to do and responsibilities to fulfill and 1,000 reasons why they shouldn't be dancing in a study with no music at nearly midnight. But Lavinia takes his hand anyway. And they sway together in the silence. Two people who didn't choose each other but are choosing to try anyway. Two people who are learning that sometimes the moon goddess's plan is better than anything they could have imagined. In the doorway, unnoticed by either adult, Aurelius peeks in. He's supposed to be asleep, but he'd wanted a glass of water and had heard voices. Now he watches his parents dance and he smiles. Thank you, moon goddess, he whispers. For sending Mama Lavinia. For making Papa smile again. For listening to me. A beam of moonlight streams through the window, illuminating the dancing couple, and for just a moment, they're caught in silver light that seems to bless them, that seems to say, this is right. This is how it was meant to be. Years will pass. Aurelius will grow up with a mother who chose him and a father who learned to love again. Lavinia will become the Luna that Silvercrest didn't know they needed, the one who leads with compassion instead of just strength, who sees every pack member as worthy of her attention and care. Marcus and Lavinia will never receive a mate bond from the moon goddess. But they'll fall in love anyway. Slowly, carefully, building something even stronger than a bond because it's freely chosen every single day. They'll have 3 more children together, and Aurelius will grow up believing that family is built on love and choice, not just blood and bonds. The Silvercrest pack will thrive under their leadership. Other packs will watch and wonder and slowly begin to question their own rigid hierarchies. The world won't change overnight, but seeds will be planted. Seeds of hope that even an Omega can become a Luna. That even the impossible can happen when you trust in something bigger than tradition and logic. But all of that is yet to come. For now, on this night 6 months after a 3-year-old changed everything, there's just a man and a woman dancing in the moonlight, and a child watching from the doorway, and the quiet certainty that sometimes the best families are the ones we choose, and the ones that choose us back. Don't forget to subscribe if this story touched your heart, because the journey of Lavinia, Marcus, and Aurelius is just beginning. And I'm sending virtual hugs to everyone who's ever felt invisible, who's ever doubted their worth, who's ever believed they weren't good enough for the life they dreamed of. You are seen. You matter. And your crown is waiting. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from so I can send you a personal hug from all the way across the world. We're all connected by these stories, by these moments of hope and transformation. And if you believe in the power of chosen family, in second chances, in children's wisdom, and in love that grows instead of just appearing, hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the most powerful magic isn't destiny or fate. It's the courage to choose love when logic says you shouldn't. It's the courage to believe a child who sees with his heart instead of his eyes. It's the courage to accept a crown you never expected to wear and try to be worthy of it anyway. Until next time, may you all find your own impossible moments. May you all discover that you're worthy of crowns you never dreamed of wearing. And may you always trust that sometimes the moon goddess knows exactly what she's doing, even when it makes no sense to anyone else. From my heart to yours, this is your reminder. You are enough. You have always been enough. And somewhere,